On a clear June morning in the year 793, the monks of Lindisfarne went about their daily routines as they had for generations. They copied manuscripts, sang their prayers, and maintained the sacred spaces of their monastery on an island off the northeastern coast of what we now call England. By mid-afternoon, that world had collapsed. Sails appeared on the horizon. Within hours, the raiders had looted the monastery's treasures, killed many of its monks, enslaved others, and left the buildings burning. The attack shocked contemporary writers so thoroughly that they began dating historical events from it, as if 793 AD marked not just a raid, but the threshold of an entirely new age. Later historians would call it the beginning of the Viking Age. But here's the puzzle. If we treat this as a chance encounter, a ship full of raiders who happen to stumble upon a rich monastery, then we have to answer some uncomfortable questions. How did a supposedly random group of attackers find one of the most important religious centers in northern England? Why did the assault target this specific place so precisely on this specific date? And most importantly, why, after 793, did similar raids continue and intensify year after year until raiding became not an anomaly but a system? The answer is that Lindisfarne was not an accident. It was the visible moment when decades of accumulated pressure, trade, politics, religious conflict, and the expansion of a continental empire finally detonated. Today, we're going to trace the currents that flowed toward that June morning and understand why an isolated monastery became the symbolic starting line for one of medieval Europe's most transformative periods. Part 1. What was Lindisfarne? To understand the shock of the Lindisfarne raid, we have to understand what Lindisfarne was. In modern imagination, a monastery can seem like a quiet retreat, a place withdrawn from the world, focused on prayer and contemplation. Early medieval monasteries were something different. Lindisfarne was one of the major religious and intellectual centers of the Kingdom of Northumbria, which ruled the north of England. This monastery was not a small community of hermits. It housed a significant library, produced important manuscripts, and held relics of major saints. The monastery itself had accumulated considerable wealth in gold, silver, and other valuable goods. But more than that, Lindisfarne was politically important. It was connected to the royal power structure of Northumbria. Kings patronized it. Nobles and bishops moved through it. In the mental geography of the realm, it was one of the anchor points of Christian order, a place where the sacred and the powerful overlapped. When raiders attacked a monastery like this, they were not just stealing objects. They were making a statement. The protection that the Christian world offered was illusory. The sanctity that the church claimed to possess could be violated. The boundary between the holy and the profane could be crossed. This is why the accounts written by monks who survived, or heard the stories from survivors, described the raid in almost apocalyptic language. They reported strange omens, lights in the sky, dragons, famines. These were not merely literary flourishes. They reflected a genuine sense that something fundamental had broken. What made the violation even more shocking was the isolation of the target. Lindisfarne sat on an island, off the coast, hidden in a bay that was not obviously visible from the sea. The island was close enough to the major fortress of Bamberg that the king's best warriors could have reached the monastery in under an hour. This raises an immediate question. How did attackers find this place? If they were truly random sea rovers, why did their voyage end at the most politically significant monastery in the region? Part 2. The North Sea World. To answer that question, we need to step back and look at the North Sea not as an empty space, but as a connected region. In the 8th century, the North Sea was not a frontier. It was a highway. People crossed it regularly, carrying goods, news, techniques, and stories. Trade networks linked England, Frisia, the coastal region of what is now the Netherlands, Scandinavia, and the Frankish kingdoms together in a web of economic relationships. These were not casual transactions. There is archaeological evidence of established trade routes, regular markets, and sustained contact across the water. Coins minted in one region turn up in excavations across the North Sea, proof that merchants and money circulated widely. The major hub for this trade was a port called Dorestad, in what is now the Netherlands. Dorestad was the central marketplace for northern Europe. Here, traders from Scandinavia met traders from England. Frisia met Franks. And because they had trade in common, and because some shared languages or at least understood multilingual commerce, they did business. What were they trading? From Scandinavia, goods that came from the far north, walrus tusks, whalebone, furs from the Arctic regions. These were luxury items, valuable and exotic. Scandinavians wanted what the South offered: high-quality iron tools and weapons, which were difficult to produce in the north with local resources. Now here is where the story takes a turn. Iron tools and weapons are useful for many things. They are useful for farming, but they are also useful for something else entirely. And if we follow that line of logic, we begin to understand why the distinction between trader and raider could become very thin indeed. The same ship that crosses the sea carrying goods can cross it carrying weapons. The same knowledge of routes that allows peaceful trade allows knowledge of targets. And when political circumstances change, when a region becomes unstable, when larger powers seem distracted, the calculation can shift from "what can I sell" to "what can I take?" But that shift did not happen all at once. For decades before 793, the balance held. The North Sea was a trade zone, and violence on its waters was limited to isolated incidents or raids by regional enemies. What we need to understand is, what changed? What tipped the balance from occasional raiding to systematic predation? The answer lies partly in the North Sea world itself, but much larger part lies in the continent, in the catastrophic expansion of the Frankish Empire and the wars that Charlemagne waged to enlarge it. Part 3. The Saxon Wars and the Frankish Pressure. By the middle of the 8th century, the Frankish kingdom controlled much of what is now France and parts of western Germany. But to the north and east lay territories that the Franks did not control: the lands of the Saxons, the Frisia, and other Germanic peoples who had never submitted to Frankish rule. These were not distant barbarians. They were neighbors. Many Saxons and Franks had intermarried over centuries. They understood each other's languages. They had traded and fought as mercenaries together. But they were also stubbornly independent. In the year 772, a king named Charlemagne, who would later be called the Great, decided that the time had come to bring these territories under Frankish control. His first campaign was military. He captured a fortress called Eresburg and destroyed a sacred Saxon religious site called the Irminsul. The destruction of this sacred tree was intentional, a symbolic assertion that the old gods of the Saxons were powerless. From this point forward, Charlemagne's Saxon Wars became one of the longest, bloodiest, and most consequential conflicts of the early medieval period. For over 30 years, from 772 to 804, the fighting continued. The wars were not simply about conquest. They were waged with explicit religious intent. The Franks sent missionaries into Saxon territory. These were often monks or bishops from England, particularly from Northumbria. They came to convert the Saxons to Christianity, to destroy pagan sanctuaries, and to integrate the Saxon lands into a Frankish Christian order. The Saxons resisted. Some resisted militarily. Others resisted the missionaries by killing them or destroying the churches they established. This created a cycle of escalating violence. The Franks would respond to Saxon uprisings with brutal campaigns. The Saxons would rebel again. Missionaries and churches would be targeted, and the cycle would repeat. By the year 782, after a decade of brutal warfare, Charlemagne decided that persuasion had failed. He issued an infamous legal code called the Capitulatio de Partibus Saxoniae, a document that declared that refusal to accept Christianity or loyalty to the Frankish king would be punished by death. Around that same time, when a Saxon leader named Widukind ambushed a Frankish army, Charlemagne responded with what sources call the Massacre of Verdun, the execution of thousands of Saxon prisoners, though the exact number is debated by historians. The scale was enormous enough that it shocked even medieval contemporaries. The wars continued. By 780, Charlemagne had established a new administrative center in Saxon territory called Paderborn, from which he could more easily govern the conquered lands. But governance required constant military pressure, because Saxon rebellions kept erupting. From 792 to 799, the northern regions especially were in near constant revolt, requiring renewed campaigns each year. Now, why do these continental wars matter for understanding a monastery in England? Because the wars created a psychological and political earthquake across the entire North Sea world. Every ruler from Scandinavia to England watched as Charlemagne expanded his kingdom. Every pagan people saw that the expansion came with Christian missionaries, with demands for tribute, with the threat of military conquest. The Danish kings watched especially carefully. They saw what happened to the Saxons. They understood that if Charlemagne continued to expand northward, it would be their turn next. And they were right to worry. In 777, Charlemagne attempted to build an alliance with the Danes. By 782, their king was sending Saxon refugees shelter, including Widukind himself, signaling that the Danes were not Frankish allies, but potential adversaries. In this climate of expanding Frankish power and hardening religious boundaries, the entire North Sea zone became more volatile. Trade could still happen, trade always happens, but the political temperature was rising, and into this volatile atmosphere came an opportunity. Part 4. The Crucial Window, 791 to 793. Between 791 and 793, something happened that changed the calculus for the northern powers. Charlemagne launched a major campaign against the Avars, a Central Asian people who threatened the southeastern frontier of his empire. For this campaign, he needed to move much of his army far from his main territories. For the first time in years, Frankish military strength was not concentrated on the northern frontier. At the same time, a plague struck Charlemagne's army and killed many of his horses. Without horses, medieval military campaigns were nearly impossible. Without horses, Charlemagne was immobilized. His army could neither advance nor return to defend his northern territories. In precisely this window, when the great Frankish king was distracted and weakened, events moved quickly. The Saxons rose in rebellion again. The Frisia, who had been conquered earlier and forced into Christian submission, rebelled as well. And somewhere in the far north, in Scandinavia, word arrived that the Frankish pressure on the northern frontier had eased. It was in this moment, in the year 793, that the raid on Lindisfarne occurred. Was it a direct retaliation by Scandinavian raiders against English monasteries that were supplying missionaries to convert the Saxons and Frisia? Possibly. The monastery at Lindisfarne was specifically known as a source of missionaries sent to northern Europe. Was it simply an act of calculated piracy, taking advantage of a moment when the political order was unstable and a wealthy target was available? Possibly that too. Or was it, as some sources suggest, an act driven by hunger and desperation, when a band of northern traders turned to violence because the normal calculations of trade no longer yielded survival? The truth is likely that all of these motivations existed simultaneously. The raid on Lindisfarne was not a random act, but neither was it purely a direct political statement. It was the collision of multiple currents: economic predation, religious conflict, political instability, and the expansion of Frankish power creating fear and opportunity in equal measure. What mattered most was what happened next. Part 5. The Escalation. The raid on Lindisfarne did not end Viking activity. It began it. After 793, the North Sea saw increasing raiding. The attacks were not random incidents, but a growing pattern. Targets became more ambitious. The organization became more sophisticated. Knowledge of profitable routes and targets spread, and the number of people willing to participate in raiding enterprises grew. One successful raid demonstrates possibility. When multiple raids succeed in rapid succession, they demonstrate that an entire new economic model has become viable, and that is when transformation occurs. By the early 9th century, what had begun as sporadic raiding had become a systematic threat to the coasts of Europe. Monasteries took steps to defend themselves. Secular rulers began to worry about coastal security. The entire calculus of power in the North Sea world had shifted. And Charlemagne, despite all his military genius, despite all his attempts to expand and organize his empire, could not reverse the process he had helped to set in motion. The expansion of Frankish power to the southeast had distracted him at a critical moment. The aggressive Christianization of northern territories had created resentments that would fester for generations. And the opening of the North Sea trade routes, which the Franks themselves had encouraged for commercial purposes, had created the very networks that raiders would exploit. By the time Charlemagne died in 814, the Viking Age was unstoppable. Within 70 years, Scandinavian fleets would be besieging Paris itself. Conclusion. So was the Lindisfarne raid an accident? No. It was consequence. Consequence of trade routes that had made the North Sea connected. Consequence of military pressures that had destabilized an entire region. Consequence of the collision between expanding Christendom and pagan peoples who found themselves trapped between submission and survival. And consequence of a crucial moment when political circumstances, a distracted empire, a moment of military weakness, a moment of opportunity, aligned in such a way that the old calculations no longer held. The Viking Age did not begin with Lindisfarne. It was born from Lindisfarne, but the seeds had been planted decades before. And Charlemagne, despite all his military genius, despite all his attempts to expand and organize his empire, could not reverse the process he had helped to set in motion. The expansion of Frankish power to the southeast had distracted him at a critical moment. The aggressive Christianization of northern territories had created resentments that would fester for generations. And the opening of the North Sea trade routes, which the Franks themselves had encouraged for commercial purposes, had created the very networks that raiders would exploit. By the time Charlemagne died in 814, the Viking Age was unstoppable. Within 70 years, Scandinavian fleets would be besieging Paris itself. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this exploration of how the Viking Age was born not from chaos, but from the collision of trade, politics, and empire, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. In the next episode, we'll follow what happened after Lindisfarne, how raids became settlements, and how Scandinavian warriors transformed from attackers into rulers of their own kingdoms. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and thank you again for being here.